Thank you, Melanie. So, friends, we want to say thank you for joining us in this lunch hour. My name is Neil Christie. I serve as Executive Minister of Connected Engagement with the Baltimore-Washington Conference of the United Methodist Church. And we are pleased to have with us the Maryland Network Against Domestic Violence, doing tremendous work, legislative work in the state of Maryland. And we're going to learn a lot about that today. We're going to be learning about the priorities, but we really are eager to hear how congregations can partner on legislative advocacy, so to address domestic violence and intimate partner violence. And before introducing our presenter, I just want to remind us of what the United Methodist Social Principles say. The United Methodist Church is very clear. We say that we recognize that family violence and abuse in all its forms, verbal, psychological, physical, sexual, is detrimental to the covenant of the human community. We encourage the church to provide a safe environment, counsel, and support for the victim. While we deplore the actions of the abuser, we affirm that persons all need to be in God's redeeming love. And so it is a holistic understanding of prevention that the United Methodist Church affirms, and we actively commit ourselves to any form of work that will eradicate domestic and intimate partner violence. I want to invite us to welcome our presenter, Melanie Shapiro. And Melanie can share a little bit more about herself, but I'll share with what I have from the Maryland Network Against Domestic Violence, and we invite you to get to know their website, and we'll put that in the chat for you as well. Melanie joined the Maryland Network Against Domestic Violence as the Public Policy Director. She comes to the organization from the Maryland Office of the Public Defender, where she worked in various roles, including as a member of the Government Relations Team and as the former Chief Attorney for the Baltimore City Juvenile Division. Ms. Shapiro represented children in child protective and juvenile delinquency proceedings at the Legal Aid Society's Juvenile Rights Division in New York City. She also served as a judicial clerk in Baltimore County Circuit Court. She received her JD from the University of Maryland School of Law and her bachelor's from Franklin and Marshall College. And I'm going to turn it on over to you, Melanie, and invite people as we hear this presentation to feel free to put your questions in the chat. We want to address all those questions. We want to allow for a portion of our time for conversation and Q&A. So please, let us know what questions you have in the chat. Feel free to introduce yourself and where you're coming from in the chat today. And Melanie, turn it back to you.
Thank you so much for having me and for the introduction. I am going to share my screen, and I do have a PowerPoint. So let me get that set up real fast. There we go. As you said, please feel free. We're not too large of a group that you can't interrupt me with questions. And so please feel free to do so. And yes, I will be open to sharing the PowerPoint after the presentation. I have Angel Campbell, who does training and technical assistance with MNADV, and she is joining today, and she can let me know the best way to do that. So thank you all for being here. What we're going to talk about are sort of our intersecting legislative priorities. And when Neil first reached out to me, we connected and realized how much of our work overlapped, and that the Baltimore-Washington Conference of United Methodist Church is hoping to engage in more legislative advocacy, and had a particular interest in working with and on behalf of survivors and victims of domestic violence. So what I'm going to share with you are what MNADV's legislative priorities are. And when I say priorities, these are overarching sort of big bucket items. These aren't specific bills. I will discuss specific bills as they apply to the larger priorities. But these are more conceptual in terms of areas of focus for us. not specific pieces of legislation. So we do have sort of a broad statement regarding our policy work, and that is that M&ADV strives to approach legislative and policy reform from an anti-oppression and intersectional lens as we advocate for survivors of intimate partner violence. We want to centralize the voices of survivors in the margins and are committed to dismantling systems that further their oppression. We are acutely aware at M&ADV that in order to end one form of oppression, we need to end all forms of oppression. And back to the title of this, the intersectional lens and intersectional priorities, it is true that there's a lot of overlapping between different forms of oppression. And so we must end all forms of oppression and all forms of gender-based violence and not just focus on one. So as you'll see throughout this presentation and our priorities, how they might not seem on its face like, oh, why is a domestic violence organization so concerned about that? And this is why. We also are aware that domestic violence, while it does impact all communities, regardless of race, socioeconomic status, immigration status, gender, all of those different areas, it does disproportionately impact our already marginalized communities. And so we focus our advocacy and have that lens as we select which pieces of legislation we want to focus on. So our first priority is always sustainable and equitable funding. We cannot do any of our work without adequate funding. There has been a lot of challenges with funding, both directly related to the pandemic as well as totally separate and apart. So just to give a brief perspective in terms of what is happening on the federal level, most of Maryland's funding for all victim services, including domestic violence services and intimate partner violence services, comes from the federal government. There is the VOCA dollars, which are the Victim of Crimes Act, which provides a large portion of money that is used for victims. And there was a necessary change that had to happen because how federal cases were being prosecuted, they were going, the money was not going into the Crime Victims Fund because there was a technical change that needed to be made. That change was made 2 years ago. However, the fund has not replenished yet. It is in the process of doing so. But for the past 2 years and for the upcoming several years, we will need to be filling the gap or dip in the VOCA dollars. And so we always are advocating both in the budget as well as the supplemental budget for sufficient dollars for all victim services, as well as specifically for the domestic violence service providers in the state of Maryland. So we cannot do any of our work without sufficient funding, nor can we meet victims' needs. And you'll hear me mention throughout this presentation that unfortunately domestic violence homicides have continued to go up in Maryland. The type of domestic violence being seen is both more severe and more complex. So a victim coming in is going to have, previously might have had one need and is now having multiple needs. And so our programs need to know, one, that they have the money to meet those needs, and two, that they have the dollars so that they can start incorporating new and promising practices. Another one of our main legislative policy priorities is access to safe and affordable housing. We often hear from victims and survivors of domestic violence is that they just want to be safe. They need somewhere to go. And so we support legislation and policies that increase and improve access to safe and affordable housing, as well as flexible funding that enables survivors the autonomy to meet their unique needs. So a lot of the federal grant dollars are unfortunately very restrictive in terms of how they can be used. And every victim's needs are going to be very different. Somebody might need money for rent. Someone might need it for daycare. Somebody might need it for a car. Somebody might need it to change the locks or for clothing so that they can go to a job that they didn't have before but now need because they've left somebody that they were financially dependent on. And so, but they can't go anywhere if they don't have somewhere safe to go. And so that is why the access to safe and affordable housing is something that is so critical for victims and survivors of domestic violence. In Maryland, we have a pretty robust shelter system that is able to meet most victims' needs, but those are not intended to be long-term. And so we really need to expand our transitional housing and the next step for victims and survivors when they're ready to leave the shelter system. Prevention. Our ultimate goal at MNADV is to get to primary prevention and prevent domestic violence from ever happening. And so we support initiatives that further our vision of a safe and equitable society that prioritizes prevention efforts and mitigates the risk of domestic violence. And that can look very different. It can look at education in schools regarding different things. It's funding, it's trauma-informed care practices. So it's all of those different aspects that will get us to the root causes of violence and start to prevent them from happening in the first place. Just going to pause real briefly. Neil, are there any questions or anything in the chat that I?
Nothing yet.
Okay. Excellent. So economic justice is another one of our major priorities. We support measures that promote economic justice and would enable victims of domestic violence to achieve financial independence, such as affordable childcare, paid sick leave, and educational opportunities. So domestic violence and economic instability are linked and intertwined with one another. And so we know that almost the statistics are astounding. I mean, it's almost every victim of domestic violence experiences some sort of financial abuse. And there are all sorts of barriers to people leaving a domestic violence situation. And we need to improve all of our systems so that people, generally speaking, including victims of domestic violence, have access to the resources that they need. We just, Maryland passed last legislative session, paid sick leave, which was a tremendous accomplishment and something that MNADV did support. And it's the kind of legislation that would enable a survivor to potentially leave a situation that they couldn't have otherwise left. Affordable childcare is another huge barrier. And so there's all sorts of different legislative opportunities in that realm that would support the economic justice and then ultimately stability for the broader community as well as victims of domestic violence. Firearms. I'm not sure how much everybody pays attention to the Supreme Court decisions, but we advocate for reasonable restrictions on access to firearms. The reason why is because the presence of a firearm in a domestic violence situation increases fatality risk by 500%. And in Maryland, the statistics that we track regarding domestic violence homicides show that firearms were used in 75% of those homicides. And the recent Supreme Court decision showed there was a recent Supreme Court decision called Bruin. And in that decision, it struck down a New York statute that required good cause or a substantial reason for access to a wear and carry permit. And Governor Hogan, Maryland had a similar statute. And by executive order, the governor struck that down. And what's been reported is that the applications have gone up significantly. There was recently ghost gun legislation that was passed in Maryland, and we did support that because these ghost guns you could mail order and assemble yourself, and they went around any background check process. And so somebody who may have had a protective order against them and was otherwise not eligible to purchase a firearm was able to still get these ghost guns. And so now they are subject to registration as well as they need to go through a background check process. I see a question regarding VAWA and are there any proposed changes? I need to check on the latest update regarding VAWA. There does, it's been debating reauthorization regarding all of that. I don't know. There are proposed changes to all of the different pieces of federal legislation that are pending, but I can check the latest update. It changes frequently, so the most recent information I have might not be the most up to date. So I can follow up with you to let you know what we're hearing the latest regarding VAWA. Was there something specific you wanted to know, or just generally speaking?
This is Kristen. No, just general.
Okay. I will find out and follow up. So another area where we focus our policy reform is regarding systems improvement and supporting victim-centered responses to domestic violence that seek to address the root causes, including non-carceral options and restorative and transformative justice. So there's a lot of different ways to respond to domestic violence. Historically, the criminal justice system has been a primary focus. And so if there are other systems that are improved, an example of legislation regarding systems improvement, this past legislative session, MNADV partnered with actually the Baltimore Jewish Council, and we worked together to pass legislation that allows anybody eligible for protective order to petition for one virtually. And this applies only for temporary orders of protection. That law goes into effect October 1st, and the temporary order of protection hearing will also be held virtually. So this will improve access to the court system, access to protective orders for victims, as well as connect them to services. So we're incredibly excited to see how that is implemented.
So there's, I'm sorry, Melanie, question that it may actually fit right here is, Janelle wanted to know, I wanted to know if there are any updates regarding the boyfriend loophole and the lethality assessment.
Okay. So the lethality assessments, MNADV actually the lethality assessment is housed within MNADV, and there are some big changes coming in terms of how it's going to be. There's a new training that we're doing and a new process in terms of how different jurisdictions implement it. It is actually not statutory in Maryland, but we have agreements with most police departments. I don't believe that there's any legislation statewide or federally that would require anything with the LAP, but it is currently, Angel might be able to chime in if she knows something different, but if the training is not fully rolled out, it should be rolled out very shortly, and actually have a meeting tomorrow regarding the LAP in Maryland. And it's something that we have a team that goes and does trainings around the country to other jurisdictions, police departments, and support them as they implement and administer the LAP themselves. And regarding the boyfriend loophole, there was something that was passed very recently, and it partially closed the loophole, I think, but it didn't fully close the loophole. And so I think there's still a little work that needs to be done there. If when we get a second, I can put in something in the chat regarding something that the national network, who is our national, put out regarding the changes to that federal legislation. And then the last area of policy work that we really focus on, it's sort of this catch-all area, which is ending the systems of oppression and supporting responses to domestic violence that promote safety and equity, and will support legislation that furthers those objectives. So examples of that are civil remedies, family law, human trafficking are all different areas where domestic violence intersects. We're very involved in work regarding child victims of sex trafficking. Right now, we do not have a safe harbor law in Maryland, and we need one. And so we're very involved in that work. There's also similar legislation, it was introduced last year, that was surrounding fines or being evicted if you called emergency responses to your homes too many times, and commonly referred to as nuisance laws. That bill did not pass, but it's being reintroduced this session. And so that's something that obviously we're very supportive of, both from a domestic violence perspective as well as a trafficking perspective.
Can you say more, if you could say a little bit more about the safe harbor laws?
Sure. So safe harbor, the legislation that was introduced last session, unfortunately, it made it almost all the way. It died with about 5 minutes left on the last day of session, which is referred to as sine die. And it would have prevented the charging of a child who was charged with prostitution or related offenses, certain related offenses, if it was the direct result of trafficking. And so what we do have in Maryland is a list of offenses where if you're an adult, you're entitled to what's called vacatur, meaning a criminal conviction could be vacated if you prove that it was a result of trafficking. So we use that list of offenses, which are low-level misdemeanors, but things that unfortunately children are often forced to do to survive, such as a low-level theft, being in the wrong place, such as like a loitering, certainly the prostitution charge. And they would have needed to prove that it was directly related to their victimization. And then they would not have been criminally prosecuted. So Maryland is in the minority of states that does not have a safe harbor law for child victims of trafficking. So we hope to fix that this year. Okay. And then there are some pieces of legislation that we don't support. We won't support any legislation or policies that will interrupt a pathway to safety for victims of domestic violence. We look at all legislation to ensure that it's grounded in equity and there are no foreseen, intended or unintended consequences for already marginalized populations. There's always a number of bills that are very well intended, but when you look at its potential impact, it could harm survivors of certain communities. It's often very unintentional, but we are mindful of that as we look at all pieces of legislation to make sure that when it is implemented as intended, that it won't cause any undue harm to anybody. Yes. So the laws that will go into effect on October 1, I see there was a question about that. Yeah. Most laws do go into effect on October 1st. And in fact, MNADV is doing a legislative lunch and learn on 3 of those laws. 1 is already in effect, 2 are going to effect on October 1st, on September 30th. But the law I mentioned was the protective order law that allows people to apply for a protective order, file or petition for a protective order from outside of the courthouse. So with a domestic violence program, a sexual assault program, a trafficking program, at the hospital, different types of places, and have that hearing, that initial hearing virtually. That goes into effect October 1st. The expanded definition of stalking goes into effect on October 1st as well, which expands the definition to include electronic surveillance or tracking. And then there's other legislation, some of which has already gone into effect just because of how it, either the date is different or procedurally, because anything that was vetoed, it was vetoed during session and then the veto was overrode. So, and that allows, that bill expanded the ability to terminate leases and who is allowed to authorize. Previously, you needed a protective order to be eligible to have certain protections for victims of domestic violence. to terminate leases in Maryland, and now there's an expanded definition of qualified third parties that include social workers, psychologists, certain doctors, as well as domestic violence programs and sexual assault programs. And so we'll go further into those bills at this other training. But those are the kinds of pieces of legislation that we look to support and advocate for. So I'm going to stop. Those are our priorities. I am going to talk a little bit about the legislative process and how people can be involved in Maryland's legislative process. And so
I'm sorry, Millie. One question before we get to that. Are crime-free programs implemented by law enforcement problematic in Maryland? There's another barrier to housing. This could be another barrier to housing.
yes.
Could you talk?
Can I just ask what you mean by crime-free programs?
And if Kristen wants to comment.
Yeah, it's a program that was developed by law enforcement back in the early 90s about crime prevention solutions. So it's a larger national program that was started, and it is prominent in several cities throughout the country, but I wasn't sure if there was anything like in Baltimore or any specific programs in Maryland.
Nothing that I am aware of, but certainly something to look into to see if there is something that's, always looking for anything that we need to address that is creating barriers for survivors. So, like, for example, we know, unfortunately, often that survivors themselves can be criminalized. So looking at criminal records, ensuring, for example, like the vacatur law for the adult survivors of trafficking, and legislation like that is something that we are always looking to as well. That's sort of falls into those systems improvement and intersectional areas of interest. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Maryland's legislative process. It is interesting and unique, and every state is a little bit different in how they do things. So Maryland is a 90-day legislative session. It runs generally the second Wednesday of January through the second Monday of April. It's 90 days long. There can be a special session, but there's all sorts of rules surrounding how that has to get called. So most of the work, if not all of the work, happens during these 90 days. If it doesn't happen during those 90 days, it's over. And you need to come back again next year. We have two chambers in Maryland. We have the House of Delegates as well as the Senate. And then our officials are elected to 4-year terms. There's 47 senators and 141 delegates when all of the seats are full. So that's just a couple of unique facts. They meet in Annapolis, in like the downtown area. There's the State House, and then there's two buildings across the street from each other. They've been doing a ton of construction down there, so it's a little challenging to get around sometimes, but hopefully that will be finished soon. But it's definitely an experience to be in Annapolis. The House has been largely virtual throughout the pandemic. The Senate went back in person in the middle of last legislative session. The floors were meeting in person. And so I assume this coming session, everything will be back in person for all of the bill hearings and everything like that. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about how a bill becomes a law. It is a little bit like a tennis match with the ball going back and forth, but it's a bill that goes back and forth. So a bill is drafted and filed by a elected legislator. Sometimes it is the legislator's own idea. Sometimes it's something that's brought to them by a constituent. Sometimes it's something that's brought to them by a group like MNADV, or it can be something that the Baltimore-Washington Conference of the United Methodist Church decides to find a legislator and have them introduce the bill. And it gets read on the floor. So there's two chambers, the House and the Senate, and the bill has an originating house or originating chamber, and it's just read on the floor. It's generally not read at all, and there's motions to waive the actual reading. But then it gets signed or then it gets sent to a committee. So there are standing committees in the House as well as the Senate, and they generally cover certain subject matters, and a bill gets sent to a committee. There's generally a committee hearing, and that is where the legislator will present the bill. There will be witnesses and testimony from people that support the bill, as well as people that oppose the bill, people that want the bill to be amended, but otherwise support the bill. And then what happens is the committee can decide to vote on it or not. No bill is required to have a vote. There can be amendments to the bill. So the legislators will meet, they will have a voting session, they will discuss, they will amend, and then the bill will be voted on. But some bills, like I said, never are discussed, never are debated, and never are voted on. Then the bill, once it's released, the committee has voted it out of a committee, which is sort of the first step to passage, goes to the first chamber, so where it was read on the floor for the first time. It goes back to the floor, and there are amendments and debate, and that's what's called second reading. Generally, that is when amendments are made, and those are from people who are not part of the committee for the most part. And then if it's passed, then it goes for third reading, gets printed for third reading. And you can vote to pass it, or it can get rejected. And that's third reading. And no floor amendments are allowed. And so if you want to do amendments, it has to go back to second reading. And there's a whole book of rules regarding this. So this is a very general overview of sort of the path that a bill will take. Then what happens is it passes out of the first chamber's floor. Everybody in the House or the Senate has voted to pass it as it has been amended. Then it goes to the second chamber, and the same process repeats itself. It gets sent to a committee for a hearing. There sometimes is a hearing, there sometimes isn't a hearing. Sometimes the hearing is just the bill sponsor, the legislator that put the bill in. Sometimes they have a full hearing. Some of that depends on whether the bill was filed in both the House and the Senate. Sometimes you'll file, it's called cross-filing the bill. The same bill will go through this process in the House as will go through the Senate. And then the same amendments will be made. And then it's sort of a cleaner process. Sometimes a bill is only filed in one chamber. So it's only filed in the House. And so then it has to go pass out of the House and go to the Senate, and then go through this whole process. And understand there are thousands of bills introduced every year, and there's 90 days to do all of this. So only those bills that have the most support and the most people pushing behind it will make it to passage. So then it goes to the committee. The committee has a hearing or hears a little bit about the bill, decides to vote on it or not vote on it. If they vote on it, there might be amendments to it. If the amendments are different, then this is the process. That there are no amendments, then it can go on a consent calendar. So if it's passed off the floor in the same form, then it can go on what's called a consent calendar. If a bill is amended, then it has to go back to the first chamber. They have to agree or disagree with those amendments. If they agree, then it's has another vote, and then it gets passed. If they disagree on the amendments, then it goes to what's called a conference committee. And generally 3 legislators from the House and 3 from the Senate are appointed by from the committee where the committee hearing was held, and they see if they can work it out. And if they can work it out, then they submit the report. It's voted on by the House chamber and the Senate chamber, and then it passes. And then it all goes to the governor. And just because a bill is passed does not mean that it becomes law. The governor has veto power. This past legislative session, for example, because the governor is up term limited, a veto is final. So there's no veto override that can happen in the beginning of the legislative session, because we're going to have different legislators and different governor. And so any bill that was vetoed this past session is no longer, it's over. It has to get reintroduced this coming session. So I'm going to pause. Does anybody have any questions sort of about the legislative process? It's something that I talk about and I'm familiar with. And so it's kind of, but it took me a while to really understand. And every year I learn new intricacies about the process. And like I said, there is a rules book. I actually have one of them right here. And this is you can kind of see it, the Maryland House Rules. It's a little book. And in it, it's 170 little pages, with the index, almost 200 pages. And it talks about all the different rules for 2022 and very procedural in nature. So this is just the general process of what happens for somebody who wants a basic understanding.
So this, Janelle just complimented you. This helps to simplify the process. So a word of gratitude. My question is this, Melanie, if for congregations that want to track your priority legislation, recognizing that for us, for the United Methodist Church, this is going to be consistent. So, we want to be able to track it appropriately and know when we're supposed to be making a phone call, sending out an action alert. What's the best practice here, given the timeline, given the process, and then also the timeline?
Sure. So there's a few different things to do. One is to sign up. So as you can see, this is sort of how you can be an advocate. And the part you're actually asking about is on the next page, but I'll skip to it now, which is you can sign up for legislative updates. So MNADV, we have a newsletter, following groups. I will say that social media is huge in terms of the Maryland legislative process. It's how a lot of people, legislators themselves, as well as organizations, communicate information regarding key pieces of legislation. And so it's probably because it's very real time. So legislators will be tweeting from the floor as they're voting on things, or in committee as they're hearing testimony. And so you can, and when I stop sharing my screen, I can go and put the link to sign up for the MNADV newsletter. I would follow any group who does legislation you're interested on. If you have a Twitter account or Facebook or Instagram, follow them there. And that's probably in terms of staying up to date. On the General Assembly website, there is a way to track legislation, and I can take everybody there in a minute when I stop sharing this and sort of show you how you can create your own list that will provide you updates and information. But if you're really looking for organizations to do that, it's sort of my job during session to send out information, and we do it through largely Twitter and through newsletters. And that's one of the things that's so important, and a way for people to really get involved. How can individuals be advocates? Well, one is you need to know who your legislators are, because they're going to listen to you. If you're a constituent and you call and you say, hi, I'm a constituent, they're going to listen to you. And you can call, you can email, you can write a letter. You can ask to meet with your legislators. If there's a particular bill that you're very interested in and support or oppose, you can submit written testimony. I don't know what the process is going to be this year. I hope that they continue to allow it to be done through the website, because that was really easy and accessible for a lot of people who might not go to Annapolis. You used to physically be there in person to file written testimony. During the pandemic, there were systems put in place where you can file remotely through their website. So hopefully that is a practice that will continue. You can also testify in person, sign up to testify. You might have a personal story to share, and that's something that the legislators really want to hear. I go and I testify on behalf of organizations and on behalf of victims and survivors. But it's very important for them to hear from people with lived experiences as well. So those are all different ways that you can actually be an advocate yourself. But if you, to stay informed, there's all of these different ways, such as signing up for legislative updates, following the groups. If there is a lobby day or an event by an organization, attend, and then you go around generally and meet with legislators about bills of interest or bills that are priorities for that organization. And then we have a general election in Maryland, and so you should vote. You should exercise that right, because our lawmakers are the people who we vote for, are the people that are making our laws and making legislation and policy decisions for all of us. And so it's important that we exercise that right that we have. So that is what I have prepared. There are a couple of things. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that I can put in chat some of the things that people have asked for. So for example, I am going to put in my chat right now. This should be the link to sign up for the MNADV newsletter. You can find us on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram as well. And then there's a lot of other groups that do good work and related work. In every county is served by a comprehensive domestic violence program. So you can identify which program. We have a list on our website as well. Not every county has one, has their own, some share, but everyone does have one. So they're another resource in terms of following what they are sharing and saying on social media, and if they have any mailings. So do we have questions or things that I can answer?
Any more questions, friends, that we want to put in the chat? We have a couple more minutes.
I have a couple of questions.
Go for it.
Okay. You've kind of talked a little bit about it, but I was wondering if you could get a little more granular with how, I guess two questions, how congregations and places of faith or places of worship can advocate and support, like through letter writing. And I'm also part of other advocacy organizations that support primarily women and girls. And I was wondering if you could speak to both of those organizations in terms of how do we advocate for legislation that eradicates domestic violence and or human trafficking, because there's a nexus between the two.
Yes, sure. So MNADV is a member-based organization. And so if you wanted to become a member during the legislative session, we do weekly legislative calls where I share information about what bills are coming up. And we share information with our membership regarding that information. Oh, great. And so those are the kinds of things, if you really want to be more involved, it's generally shooting me an email and saying, can I join these calls? And that's when I share that information. Certain bills that are very important to the network, right? Like there's a ton of wonderful legislation, some not wonderful legislation that is introduced every session, and we have limited capacity. And so we have to prioritize. So if we have something that is a priority bill, we might ask, send out a sample. We have somebody new from communications. So I hope to be able to do a lot of organizations will send out to the mailing list, action alerts. And so you can sort of click through and sign your name onto something that will send an email to a legislator that will be a pre-drafted something like, please vote in support of, or in opposition to, or we want this amendment. And you just sort of put in your information and click. And so it really is about connecting with those organizations that you're aligned with, and then when you get those emails, taking the action. And then if, depending on your level of involvement, if you want to, be more or less involved, and if attending trainings and opportunities that the network offers. So, it's great that you are very connected and want to be more involved. And so we'd love to, sort of figure out the best ways to do that. And again, M&ADV, for example, I'm not exactly sure how it's going to be done this year. Historically, we'd have a memorial service. We memorialize the victims of domestic violence homicides it happens to fall during the legislative session, and it used to be in Annapolis. And then the pandemic started and it was virtual. And so I don't know if a final decision has been made this year, but that's, for example, another opportunity to attend the event. Legislators are generally there and attending as well, and discussing different pieces of legislation, because what we're ultimately trying to do is prevent domestic violence from happening in the first place. And that was normally sort of, an event that we had. And then different organizations and coalitions will have what we call lobby days. So those are opportunities. They have not happened in several years. So again, I think they'll be back this year. I don't know. M&ADV has not done one before. So it's something that we might do this year, we might not do. We've never done one before. Have to see what we're doing with, we normally have the memorial service, which is for the families and for the victims. And so, we would have two separate events if we did that.
If you have any information about those lobby days, are you sending it out to members?
Sure. So, like I said, none of that, they haven't happened at all for a couple of years.
Right.
And so, I'm just going to assume that this year, I don't know that any of us really know what the future holds. I think that they haven't been allowed for a couple of years. So I don't know, but if we have that, that's the information that we would be putting out on social media and things like that. And sometimes they surround not so much a specific organization, but a specific bill. So the Time to Care Act, for example, had many, many lobby days and different advocacy days, and people would get down and stand together and go and talk to legislators. So that was something that wouldn't be something that we would organize, but we would potentially have promoted because it was an issue that was important to us. If there's something surrounding a bill like a safe harbor, again, not necessarily our bill, but a bill that we support, and there's groups coming together, we would put it out there and encourage people to come and attend. So, and generally the way that we do that is through social media, and we are developing this legislative listserv. We don't want to send all of our membership. Not everybody wants to get all of the legislative updates. So developing email lists for those who want to receive all those legislative updates.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Friends, is there one more question? We have time for maybe one more question, two more questions. Either in the chat or you can unmute yourself, whatever you prefer.
Melanie, I promise I'm not going to ask any more questions. I'm going to be quiet, but
great questions. Keep going.
If we want to reach out to you, because I have just this awful pattern of thinking of things after the meeting is over, and sort of a delayed reaction. That is what I was going to ask you. Never mind.
There you go. My email is in the chat. And so that is there. And I'm also putting in the chat the information. I believe this is the most recent information, the VAWA reauthorization, because it was reauthorized And this is what the National Network to End Domestic Violence put out there regarding that.
I was really disappointed that the boyfriend loophole wasn't closed. I can't wrap my mind around why it wasn't, but
Yeah.
we sojourn on.
Yes. So it will, I think the work continues, and I have to see that update was from March. So I'm going to verify. I don't think that anything else. I think that is the latest, but I always like to double check to make sure that there was nothing else that was put out that has useful information. But that I think is their most recent update. There might be a summary or something like that on the national networks website, and I believe they did do something that addressed the boyfriend loophole. So I'll see if I can find that as well.
Okay.
Melanie, this is Kristen. I'm like Janelle. I reflect. So now I've thought of a question.
Yes.
And that is like how much effort, well, not effort. I know you all have a lot of effort. How much capacity does the network have like to collaborate? I'm thinking of like Moms Demand Action or, other groups that might, parallel with legislative priorities that you have.
Sure. So I partner with a tremendous amount of organizations. We're part of a lot of different groups and coalitions that do good work that is related. Coalitions sort of form, and then there might be leadership changes or something like that. But we are part of, for example, the Maryland Violence Prevention Coalition, which does a lot of work regarding looks a lot at firearms and general violence prevention. There's the Coalition to Protect Maryland's Children that we're involved in. There are specific bills that will join coalitions. Time to Care is an example of a specific coalition around one bill. We are looking at, and then we'll just collaborate with others as we're working at legislation with groups that are similarly aligned to sort of maximize our potential at passage and leverage everybody's expertise there. And so I love when different people come to me and bring ideas and say, this is what we're seeing, or have you thought about this? And then partner together. So, that's really how I prefer to come up with legislation, is directly from those who are impacted or work with people directly impacted. There are certainly national trends. There's also legislators who have good ideas and put it in because a constituent came to them. So we might support something or advocate for something that didn't come from us, but would benefit those that we serve. So I hope that answers your question.
It does. Thank you. Yeah. Well, because I was also thinking, as we get your emails, like if when you do the legislative updates or whatever, if you identify I'm just thinking of my own approach and then like supporting their work or like reaching out, if there's ways that we can support other agencies that are partners in this work together.
Got it. Yes.
Thanks.
Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions. If we have no other questions or comments, I take it that this is now time for appreciation. And so we want to say, on behalf of all those who are present, those who will be watching this recording, that we want to say thank you to Melanie for the work that she's doing. I see a thumbs up. This is not easy work. It is not easy work to interpret to a broad audience where folks have we focus, right? We have specialties in different areas, and the hope here is that congregations can be a part of the solution and support just, equitable legislation that will address this issue. And so we are eager to continue to work with Melanie, work with the organization to promote, to send out our action alerts, to make our phone calls, to show up, to do our prayer vigils, but then to speak very clearly and forcefully about why the legislation matters and which legislation we want to support. And so we want to keep this conversation going. This presentation will be available to you. We invite you to please post it, social media, church websites, let people know how to connect with Melanie and how they can connect with the Baltimore-Washington Conference, so that as we send out our action alerts, we ask people to make phone calls, they'll partner with us. And so thank you for your expertise. Thank you for your passion, and thank you for your laying this all out for us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, friends. You have a wonderful rest of the afternoon. God bless you. Stay in touch. I put in the chat my text for texting me, calling me, my email. Please, if you have any questions, you're welcome to do any of those, and I'll respond to text, phone call, or email. And it's right there in the chat. Thank you, friends. Take care.